The Mongol campaigns across Eurasia produced victories that looked incomplete on every contemporary map. Major fortified cities were left standing. Capitals were bypassed. Strongholds remained unconquered, yet entire political systems collapsed anyway. This was not hesitation. It was not mercy. And it was not a lack of capability. In the early 13th century, Mongol commanders repeatedly chose not to seize the most obvious targets of power. Instead, they struck elsewhere: supply corridors, tributary regions, communication routes, and the connective tissue that allowed states to function as states. Why would an expanding empire deliberately ignore the symbols of victory that every military doctrine of the era demanded? What did Mongol command believe would happen after those cities were left behind? And more dangerously, what if that belief was wrong? Because this was not conquest by force of arms alone. It was conquest by destabilization. A strategy built on the assumption that a system can be killed without touching its heart. But assumptions collapse faster than walls. The strategic problem faced by Mongol command was not how to defeat a city. It was how to defeat an entire political system without being consumed by it. Fortified cities were designed to absorb pressure. They pulled attackers into long sieges, forced logistical stagnation, drained manpower, and froze momentum. For sedentary empires, this was acceptable. For a force built on mobility, tempo, and dispersed control, it was existentially dangerous. The Mongols confronted a dilemma most doctrines refused to acknowledge. What if taking the most important target was the fastest way to lose the war? To conquer every major city meant inheriting every problem those cities produced: garrisons, supply chains, revolts, administration, legitimacy disputes. Expansion would slow. Command coherence would fracture. And the empire would begin to resemble the systems it was trying to destroy. So the Mongols reframed the objective. Victory was no longer defined by occupation. It was defined by inoperability. If a state could no longer mobilize armies, collect taxes, coordinate defense, or maintain internal trust, then its cities, no matter how tall their walls, became irrelevant. This is why the strategy is fundamentally unorthodox. It does not seek decisive battle. It seeks decisive dysfunction. And once that lens is applied, the question shifts from why cities were bypassed to something far more unsettling. What kind of war begins when the enemy is left standing but already finished? To understand why bypassing fortified cities was even conceivable, we need to step back from the battlefield and look at the environment in which this decision emerged. Not terrain alone. Not armies alone. But the full strategic ecosystem. The opposing systems. The Mongols were not fighting a single, unified enemy. They confronted sedentary states built on layered authority: courts, tax collectors, local governors, vassals, merchant networks, and religious institutions, all bound together by slow communication and fragile loyalty. These systems functioned only as long as three conditions held. Revenue moved upward: taxes, grain, tribute. Orders moved downward: commands, appointments, punishments. Trust moved laterally, between local elites, military commanders, and the center. Fortified cities sat at the nodes of this system. They were administrative hubs, not just military ones. But the cities themselves were not autonomous. They depended on the countryside for food, on trade routes for wealth, on regional stability for manpower, on the belief that the center still controlled events. Remove any one of those inputs, and a city's strength began to decay long before its walls were tested. Mongol constraints, often ignored, always present. Popular narratives emphasize Mongol freedom of movement. Less discussed is what they could not afford to do. They could not remain static. Their military power was inseparable from horse health, pasture availability, seasonal rhythm, distributed command. A prolonged siege inverted every advantage they possessed. It concentrated forces. It halted movement. It created predictable patterns. And it exposed the army to attrition that could not be replaced quickly. This is critical. The Mongols were not choosing between fast victory and slow victory. They were choosing between a strategy compatible with their system and one that would quietly destroy it. Political geography: a web, not a pyramid. Most sedentary states imagined power as vertical. Capital at the top. Provinces below. Cities as anchors. In practice, power was horizontal and uneven. Local elites negotiated loyalty. Governors hedged their bets. Border regions operated with semi-independence. Trade cities cared more about routes than rulers. This created a structural vulnerability. If pressure arrived everywhere except the capital lost the ability to act meaningfully. Orders arrived too late. Reinforcements went to the wrong places. Local commanders stopped waiting for permission. The Mongols did not invent this vulnerability. They recognized it, and then exploited it relentlessly. Time as a strategic constraint. Sedentary states assumed time favored the defender. Walls bought time. Sieges exhausted attackers. Delays allowed coalitions to form. This assumption collapsed under a different tempo of war. Mongol operations unfolded across vast distances in compressed time frames. Multiple columns moved independently. Targets appeared where they were least expected. The result was not just confusion. It was decision paralysis. By the time a response was formulated, the situation had already changed. This matters because fortifications only work when the defender understands what they are defending against. Here, they did not. Information lag and cognitive overload. Messages traveled slowly. Reports contradicted one another. Rumors spread faster than orders. Was the Mongol force advancing north or south? Was the bypassed city a feint or a spared target? Should armies concentrate or defend locally? Every answer risked being wrong. And wrong answers in a brittle system are worse than no answers at all. The Mongols did not need perfect intelligence. They needed their enemies to have imperfect understanding and to act on it. The illusion of safety. Fortified cities created psychological shelter. Walls did not just protect bodies. They protected assumptions. As long as a city stood unconquered, its leaders could believe. The state still existed. Relief might arrive. The threat could be negotiated or redirected. Bypassing these cities weaponized that belief. While commanders waited behind walls, the world outside was dismantled. Markets collapsed. Tax convoys vanished. Allies defected quietly. Rural areas emptied or changed hands. When reality finally intruded, it did so all at once. Not as a siege, but as a revelation. Strategic asymmetry. The Mongols did not need cities to fall quickly. They needed systems to fail predictably. Their enemies needed cities to hold indefinitely and the system to function simultaneously. That asymmetry shaped every decision. The longer a city remained isolated but unconquered, the worse its situation became, politically, economically, psychologically. From the Mongol perspective, the city was already neutralized. From the defender's perspective, it still mattered, and that mismatch was fatal. The central blind spot. Here lies the most important element of the strategic landscape. Sedentary powers could imagine losing battles. They could imagine losing provinces. They could even imagine losing armies. What they could not imagine was winning cities and losing the war at the same time. Their doctrines had no language for it. Their command structures were not built to detect it. Their leaders were trained to respond to threats they recognized. Bypassing fortified cities created a kind of war their enemies did not know they were fighting. And by the time they understood, they no longer had the means to respond. Because in a system that cannot move, speed becomes destruction. Military doctrine in the pre-modern world was not ambiguous about priorities. It was explicit. And it was consistent across cultures. Secure the strongpoints. Neutralize fortified cities. Eliminate threats to your rear. Anything else was considered reckless. What correct war looked like. A conventional commander confronting an advancing enemy faced a narrow menu of acceptable choices. Advance meant methodical conquest. Each city taken reduced resistance. Each siege validated control. Each captured capital signaled legitimacy. This logic was not superstition. It was built on real constraints. Leaving a major city unconquered behind your lines created a potential rally point for counterattack. A logistical threat to supply routes. A political symbol that resistance was still viable. Doctrine treated these risks as non-negotiable. A campaign that ignored them was not bold. It was irresponsible. The siege as a strategic anchor. Siege warfare was not merely a tactic. It was a stabilizing mechanism. It forced clarity. Everyone understood where the war was happening. Resources flowed toward a visible objective. Success or failure could be measured. Most importantly, siege warfare slowed time. And slowing time favored states with bureaucratic depth, surplus population, predictable supply systems. Sedentary empires were built for this rhythm. Why doctrine expected the Mongols to fail? From a doctrinal perspective, the Mongol approach violated three core principles simultaneously. First, they exposed their rear. Second, they refused decisive engagement at recognized centers of power. Third, they accepted ambiguity instead of closure. Any one of these would be criticized. All three together should have been catastrophic. A doctrinal commander would ask, what happens when the bypassed city regains initiative? What happens when local forces cut your routes? What happens when your dispersed columns are isolated and destroyed in detail? These were not theoretical concerns. They were standard lessons learned through centuries of warfare. The hidden assumption doctrine never questioned. Doctrine assumed something it never articulated: that the enemy remains a functioning system until physically dismantled. Cities were treated as organs, capitals as brains. Destroy them, and the body dies. The Mongols questioned that anatomy. They suspected that systems could be rendered non-functional without removing their organs, by severing coordination, trust, and predictability. This was not a doctrinal adjustment. It was a doctrinal inversion. Why following doctrine would have failed the Mongols? Had Mongol command adhered to conventional logic, several outcomes were likely. Their forces would have stalled at the first major fortified belt. Mobility would have collapsed into static investment. Horse herds would have degraded. Operational tempo would have flattened. Most dangerously, Mongol command would have been forced into centralization, concentrating decision-making and manpower in siege zones. That ran directly against their strength, distributed initiative. Doctrine demanded concentration. The Mongols required dispersion. Doctrine demanded patience. The Mongols required momentum. Doctrine demanded visible conquest. The Mongols required systemic collapse. The paradox of safety. Doctrinal thinking treats safety as territorial control. Secure your rear. Anchor your flanks. Reduce uncertainty. But in a fast, multi-vector campaign, safety can become a trap. Each city taken increases obligations. Garrison forces. Administrative oversight. Supply commitments. Instead of reducing uncertainty, conquest multiplies it. The Mongols recognized a counterintuitive truth. Every city captured too early made the war harder to finish. This was a direct rejection of textbook logic. Why other commanders could not copy this? The Mongol approach was not simply clever. It was structurally exclusive. Most armies could not replicate it even if they understood it. They lacked the logistical independence to operate dispersed, the command culture to tolerate ambiguity, the political authority to accept delayed validation. A commander who bypassed cities and failed would be accused of incompetence or treason. A Mongol commander who bypassed cities operated within a system that rewarded initiative and punished hesitation. Doctrine is not just about tactics. It is about institutional tolerance for risk. And here, the gap was absolute. The doctrinal blind spot. The deepest failure of doctrine was not tactical. It was conceptual. Doctrine prepared leaders to fight entities. Armies. Cities. Capitals. It did not prepare them to fight processes. The Mongols were not trying to win battles faster. They were trying to end wars before the enemy realized what kind of war they were in. Doctrine could not see this coming. And when it did, it had no tools to respond. Because a rulebook designed to manage pressure cannot survive a strategy that dissolves the system applying that pressure. This decision did not emerge fully formed. It was not a single moment of inspiration. It was the result of pressure accumulating inside Mongol command, pressure created by contradiction. The internal friction. Mongol leadership was not monolithic. There were commanders who understood siegecraft. There were advisors who came from sedentary cultures. There were engineers, defectors, and administrators who could make city-taking possible. The debate was not whether cities could be taken. It was whether they should be taken, and when. Every major fortress presented the same question. Do we stop here and secure certainty? Or do we move on and accept instability? The first option promised legitimacy and closure. The second promised speed and risk. Most military cultures default to closure. The Mongols hesitated, and that hesitation mattered. The pressure of scale. As Mongol campaigns expanded, scale became the dominant constraint. Early victories were manageable. Later ones multiplied complexity. Each conquered city required garrisons, administrators, tribute enforcement, conflict mediation. These were not battlefield tasks. They were state-building tasks. And state-building slows armies. Mongol command recognized an emerging danger. If conquest continued to look like traditional occupation, the empire would collapse under its own expansion. The question was no longer how to defeat enemies. It was how to avoid becoming them. The core assumptions behind the decision. From this pressure emerged a set of assumptions, not certainties. Assumption 1. A fortified city is only powerful as long as it remains connected to a functioning system. Assumption 2. If the surrounding system collapses fast enough, the city will become politically irrelevant before it becomes militarily dangerous. Assumption 3. Fear, uncertainty, and isolation can substitute for occupation, temporarily, but decisively. These assumptions were not guaranteed. If any one of them failed, the strategy would unravel. What the strategy was really targeting. Bypassing cities was not avoidance. It was redirection. The real targets were tax routes, seasonal migration corridors, provincial elites, communication chains. This was an attack on connectivity, not on masonry. A city cut off from grain was a problem. A city cut off from authority was a liability. A city cut off from information was a danger to itself. The Mongols aimed to create all three conditions simultaneously. Institutional risk tolerance. One reason this decision could exist at all was Mongol command culture. Initiative was decentralized. Commanders were expected to operate independently. Failure was tolerated if it resulted from aggressive action rather than hesitation. This mattered. A bypass strategy requires trust. Trust that subordinate commanders will not freeze. Trust that risk taken now prevents greater risk later. Trust that absence of immediate results does not mean failure. Most states could not sustain this psychologically. Mongol leadership could, barely. The role of intelligence and learning. This strategy was not theoretical. It was iterative. Early campaigns revealed patterns. Cities held while regions collapsed. Rulers negotiated once isolation set in. Resistance hardened inside walls but softened outside them. These observations reinforced belief in the approach. But belief is not proof. Each new campaign extended the logic further, and with it, the danger. The moment of commitment. There came a point when the strategy stopped being experimental. When enough cities had been bypassed without catastrophic retaliation. When enough systems had failed before sieges became necessary. When commanders began to expect collapse as a sequence, not an outcome. At that moment, bypassing cities became doctrine in practice, even if never written as such. The war was no longer about taking ground. It was about controlling the rate at which reality caught up with defenders. The unspoken fear. Inside Mongol command, there was a fear no one could fully articulate. What if the enemy understood what was happening? What if a state chose to abandon cities early? What if it consolidated mobile forces instead of defending walls? What if it refused isolation and embraced disruption? The strategy relied on the enemy not adapting fast enough. That dependence on opponent error was its greatest strength, and its deepest vulnerability. Because once recognized, the logic could be countered. And if countered, there would be no safety net. This was not a plan designed to survive failure. It was a plan designed to end the war before failure became visible. A strategy that looks elegant on paper becomes dangerous the moment it meets reality. Bypassing fortified cities did not reduce risk. It redistributed it. Execution was where the Mongol approach could either validate its assumptions or collapse under them. From concept to movement. The first operational shift was deceptively simple. Do not stop. Columns advanced past strongpoints without committing to siege posture. No encirclement. No investment. No prolonged presence. Movement itself became the signal. To the defenders, this was disorienting. Cities prepared for assault that never came. Commanders waited for an enemy that had already vanished into their hinterland. But for the Mongols, constant movement served a deeper function. It preserved tempo dominance. Tempo was not speed alone. It was the ability to force the enemy to respond on a timeline they did not control. Distributed columns, central intent. Execution relied on fragmentation without disintegration. Mongol forces operated in multiple columns, often separated by vast distances. Each column had operational autonomy, but not strategic independence. They shared intent, not instructions. This mattered because bypassing cities created operational ambiguity. Subordinate commanders had to decide which targets to ignore, which supply routes to sever, when to engage, and when to vanish. Rigid command would have failed immediately. Flexibility was not optional. It was structural. Logistics without anchors. Traditional logistics depend on fixed points, depots, supply lines, secure rear areas. Bypassing cities removed all three. Mongol logistics functioned differently. Reliance on herd mobility, seasonal foraging, local extraction under coercion, rapid redistribution rather than storage. This system thrived only under movement. The moment an army stopped, its logistics began to degrade. Which meant siege warfare was not just costly, it was corrosive. The risk of overextension. Bypassing cities stretched the campaign footprint. Lines became conceptual rather than geographic. Rear areas were not secured. They were simply left behind. This created a constant risk. Local uprisings. Counterattacks from bypassed garrisons. Disruption of movement corridors. The strategy assumed that fear, speed, and confusion would suppress organized resistance long enough for systemic collapse to occur. If that assumption failed, Mongol columns could be isolated. There was no margin for delay. Micro-twist, when isolation cut both ways. There were moments when the strategy nearly broke itself. Bypassing a fortified city meant relinquishing control over its population. Information flowed unpredictably. Messages from bypassed regions sometimes reached allies faster than Mongol intelligence could track. In these moments, the Mongols faced a paradox. The same ambiguity they imposed on the enemy also applied to themselves. Columns had to operate without full situational awareness. They could not be certain which regions had collapsed and which were merely quiet. This forced commanders into decision-making under radical uncertainty. Hesitation invited encirclement. Aggression invited overreach. The fragility of momentum. Momentum was the strategy's lifeline. Once lost, everything unraveled. A delayed column risked becoming the focal point for resistance. A stalled movement signaled vulnerability. A failed raid emboldened defenders. This is why execution favored relentless pressure. Even partial success was sufficient, as long as it preserved movement. Complete victory was unnecessary. Continuation was essential. Micro-twist, environmental constraint. Execution was also hostage to terrain and season. Weather could slow movement. Pasture scarcity could force concentration. Rivers and choke points could undo dispersion. When environmental factors compressed Mongol formations, the bypass strategy became dangerous. Suddenly, the army resembled the very force it was designed not to be. Concentrated. Predictable. Static. At those moments, Mongol commanders faced hard choices. Engage cities they had intended to ignore, or risk operational paralysis. This was not theoretical. It happened. And each time, it tested the integrity of the strategy. The invisible work, psychological pressure. Execution was not just physical. It was cognitive. Bypassing cities sent a message. You are not worth stopping for. For defenders, this was destabilizing. Was the city irrelevant, or about to be encircled later? Should forces sortie, or conserve strength? Was relief coming, or already impossible? Uncertainty became corrosive. The longer a city was ignored, the more internal pressure it generated. When execution failed to kill the system, not every bypass worked as intended. Some cities adapted, organizing mobile forces, coordinating with other strongholds, refusing isolation. In these cases, the Mongols faced the nightmare scenario: a functioning enemy system with intact fortified bases behind their lines. When this occurred, Mongol command had to improvise. Sudden reversals, punitive destruction, selective sieges. These were not signs of doctrinal purity. They were emergency corrections. Execution was never clean. It was survival-driven. The cost of no safety net. The most important truth about execution is this: the strategy had no graceful failure mode. It could not slow down. It could not consolidate. It could not pause to reassess without risking collapse. Every decision compounded risk. Success reduced danger rapidly. Failure amplified it instantly. This is why the strategy was terrifying, even for those who employed it. Because the Mongols were not executing a plan designed to win eventually. They were executing a plan designed to win before consequences arrived. And that meant the real test was not whether the strategy worked, but whether the enemy could survive long enough to force it to stop. And once that question was asked, the war entered its most dangerous phase. The bypass strategy only works if the enemy reacts predictably. Not wisely. Not creatively. Predictably. What followed was not a collapse of courage. It was a collapse of interpretation. What the enemy thought was happening. From inside fortified cities and central courts, the Mongol advance looked incoherent. There was no single front. No decisive siege. No clear axis of attack. Reports arrived fragmented. Raids in one province. Devastation in another. Silence where battle was expected. This ambiguity produced a fatal question. Where is the real threat? Most command structures answered it incorrectly. They assumed bypass meant delay, not intent. That cities were being ignored temporarily. That decisive confrontation was inevitable. So they prepared for the wrong future. The first misread: overvaluing the fortress. Defenders treated walls as anchors of control. As long as the city stood, they believed authority remained intact. Resistance was meaningful. Time favored them. This belief shaped every decision. Garrisons were reinforced. Supplies were hoarded. Sorties were limited. But the war was not happening at the walls. By the time commanders realized their hinterlands were gone, tax routes severed, allies silent, grain fields empty, the fortress had become a sealed container of unresolved problems. The city was safe. The system was not. The second misread: centralization under pressure. Faced with uncertainty, many states did what bureaucracies always do under stress. They centralized. Orders tightened. Initiative was restricted. Local commanders were told to hold position and await instruction. This was catastrophic. The Mongol strategy thrived on reaction delay. Centralization increased it. By the time decisions reached the field, conditions had changed. Relief forces moved toward outdated threats. Resources were committed where they no longer mattered. The enemy was not slow. Their decision cycle was misaligned. The third misread: expecting the war to behave. Most defenders believed war had rules. That escalation followed patterns. That devastation led to negotiation. That campaigns exhausted attackers. They waited for familiar signals. But the Mongol campaign did not seek negotiation. It sought exhaustion of function. No siege meant no bargaining point. No occupation meant no administrator to bribe. No capital assault meant no clear political exchange. The war did not escalate. It dissolved structure. Information as a liability. As panic spread, information volume increased. More reports. More warnings. More conflicting interpretations. Instead of clarity, leaders received noise. Some regions exaggerated threats. Others minimized them to avoid blame. Rumors outpaced facts. In this environment, accuracy mattered less than confidence. And confidence was evaporating. The Mongols did not need perfect deception. They needed the enemy to misweight truth. The moment of strategic error. There was always a moment, often brief, when the bypass strategy could have been countered. If the enemy had abandoned fixed defenses early, consolidated mobile forces, accepted territorial loss to preserve system integrity, the Mongol assumptions would have been tested. But doing so required violating doctrine, prestige, and political expectation. Few leaders were willing to be the first to do that. So they clung to cities. And in doing so, they surrendered the war outside them. When reaction turned into self-sabotage, some states attempted adaptation, too late. They launched relief expeditions that arrived after networks had collapsed. They ordered counter-raids without intelligence support. They fractured their own forces chasing dispersed threats. Each reaction was logical in isolation. Together, they accelerated collapse. The enemy was not outmaneuvered. They were led into multiplying their own errors. The psychological break. The final failure was not military. It was psychological. Once leaders realized that holding cities did not restore control, confidence shattered. Commanders hesitated. Orders softened. Local elites began negotiating independently. The system lost its will to coordinate. At that point, Mongol victory was inevitable, even if no city had yet fallen. Because war is not won when the enemy is defeated. It is won when the enemy can no longer act as one. And once the threshold was crossed, the outcome no longer depended on Mongol action, only on time. By the time outcomes became visible, the war had already been decided. Not by a single battle. Not by the fall of a capital. But by the quiet failure of systems that could no longer function. The outcome that looked incomplete. From the outside, Mongol victories often appeared unfinished. Cities still stood. Walls remained intact. Administrative centers existed on paper. Yet armies stopped forming. Taxes stopped moving. Orders stopped being obeyed. What had collapsed was not territory, but capacity. The state still occupied space. It no longer occupied time. Decisions came too late. Responses targeted problems that no longer mattered. Authority existed without leverage. This is why the Mongols could move on while resistance lingered behind them. The war had already been won, even if the map did not yet show it. The human cost, diffuse and relentless. This strategy did not reduce suffering. It redistributed it. Instead of concentrated devastation at siege sites, hardship spread outward. Rural populations were disrupted first. Trade routes collapsed. Food systems fractured. Cities absorbed refugees they could not sustain. Disease followed density. Scarcity produced internal violence. Because the system failed gradually, suffering extended over time. Not as a single catastrophe, but as a prolonged unraveling. There was no moment of surrender that brought relief. Only exhaustion. The cost to Mongol forces. This strategy demanded extraordinary endurance. Constant movement strained men and animals alike. Logistics had no redundancy. Intelligence gaps multiplied risk. Commanders operated without confirmation of success. They advanced without knowing whether collapse was imminent or illusory. Psychologically, this was punishing. There was no clear victory point. No secure rear. No moment to consolidate without fear of reversal. Every pause invited danger. Political cost, both immediate and deferred. Bypassing cities avoided early administrative burden. But it created long-term instability. Once systems collapsed, power vacuums emerged. Local elites acted autonomously. Compliance was enforced through fear rather than integration. This reduced short-term resistance. It increased long-term fragility. The Mongol Empire expanded faster than it could stabilize. Control depended on continued pressure. When pressure eased, fractures widened. This was not a failure of conquest. It was the price of conquest by destabilization. The cost of assumptions. The strategy rested on assumptions that were never guaranteed. That enemies would misinterpret intent. That cities would remain passive. That fear would suppress coordination long enough. If any of these failed, the consequences were immediate. A single organized counterforce could threaten dispersed columns. A coordinated uprising behind the lines could sever movement corridors. A rapid doctrinal adaptation could neutralize tempo advantage. The strategy allowed no margin for error. It worked not because it was safe, but because it ended wars before safety was required. The counterfactual: if it had failed, if the enemy had adapted faster, the Mongols would have faced disaster. Their forces were too dispersed to absorb concentrated counterattack. Their logistics were too lean to endure prolonged stalemate. Their command structure relied on initiative that could become fragmentation under pressure. Failure would not have been gradual. It would have been sudden. The same speed that dismantled enemy systems would have magnified collapse on their side. This is critical. The strategy did not fail because it was perfect. It succeeded because it outran its own consequences. No heroism, no mercy. There is a temptation to frame this strategy as brilliance alone. That would be dishonest. It was effective. It was ruthless. It inflicted systemic harm without offering pathways to recovery. The Mongols did not seek annihilation. But neither did they seek reconciliation. Their objective was not peace. It was irreversibility. Once a system crossed the point of dysfunction, return was impossible without total reconstruction. That was the real victory condition. The silent ending. Most wars end with ceremony. Treaties. Surrenders. Capitals falling. This war ended quietly. With silence on roads that once carried grain. With officials issuing orders no one answered. With cities intact but irrelevant. And by the time swords were sheathed, there was nothing left to negotiate. Because the war had not destroyed the enemy. It had made the enemy unable to exist as a system. And when that happens, victory no longer needs to be declared. Bypassing fortified cities was never the lesson. It was the symptom. The real insight of the Mongol strategy lies deeper, in how war was redefined from an act of conquest into an act of system interruption. What this strategy was actually about. At its core, this was not a tactic against walls. It was a theory about how power functions under stress. Power, in sedentary states, was not stored in armies alone. It was stored in predictable taxation, enforceable authority, coordinated response, shared belief that the center still mattered. The Mongols did not attack these directly. They removed the conditions that allowed them to exist. When those conditions disappeared, power evaporated, without needing to be seized. This reframes victory. Victory was not the occupation of space. It was the collapse of coherence. The rule it broke, explicitly. Traditional doctrine treats control as additive. Take ground. Secure it. Add it to your holdings. The Mongol approach treated control as fragile and subtractive. Remove connectivity. Remove timing. Remove trust. What remains may look intact, but cannot function. This is why the strategy felt invisible to those trained to look for capture, occupation, and decisive battle. Nothing fell. Everything stopped working. Why this was truly unorthodox. Many armies have bypassed cities. Few have done so as a governing principle. What makes the Mongol case distinct is not movement, but intent. They were not racing toward a capital. They were not delaying sieges temporarily. They were deliberately allowing symbols of power to survive while rendering them meaningless. That inversion is rare. Most commanders cannot tolerate the idea that the enemy still appears strong. The Mongols accepted, and exploited, that discomfort. The three strategic principles hidden inside. Stripped of historical detail, the strategy resolves into three principles. First, systems collapse before structures do. Walls fall last, not first, when the war targets coordination rather than force. Second, speed is not about arrival. It is about denial. The Mongols did not move fast to reach objectives. They moved fast to prevent the enemy from stabilizing any interpretation of events. Third, control delayed is often control denied. Waiting to occupy can be more effective than occupying immediately, if the system collapses in the interim. These are not comforting principles. They offer no clean victory moments. They demand tolerance for ambiguity. Why this strategy is rarely replicated. The approach is difficult to imitate because it is not modular. It requires decentralized command, logistical independence, cultural acceptance of delayed validation, political insulation from accusations of failure. Most institutions fail at the last requirement. Leaders are judged by visible success. This strategy postpones visibility until it is irreversible. That delay is politically dangerous. The risk that never goes away. Even in success, the strategy carries a permanent risk. If pressure stops, systems can reconstitute. If fear fades, coordination returns. If ambiguity resolves, resistance organizes. This means the strategy demands continuous dominance of tempo. The moment tempo equalizes, the advantage vanishes. In that sense, the Mongols were not building stability. They were exploiting instability faster than anyone else could. What this changes about how we understand war. This case forces a re-evaluation of what it means to win. Winning is not always the moment of capture. It can be the moment when the enemy loses the ability to act meaningfully. That moment is often quiet, often missed, often denied. And it explains why many historical accounts feel unsatisfying. They look for the wrong ending. The final clarification. This was not genius without cost. It was not inevitable. And it was not universally applicable. It worked because the enemy expected a different kind of war. Adaptation came too late. Mongol command accepted risk others could not. Strip away any one of those conditions, and the strategy collapses. Which leads to the most important conclusion. This was not a strategy for winning wars. It was a strategy for ending them before the enemy realized how they were being fought. And that is why it remains disturbing. Not because it was violent, but because it reveals how fragile organized power becomes once its assumptions are violated. The Mongols did not conquer by sparing cities. They conquered by emptying them of relevance. Their wars did not end with gates falling. They ended when systems stopped answering themselves. This is uncomfortable history because it denies us a clean narrative. No heroic last stand. No singular collapse. Only a gradual realization that the war had already moved on. What this strategy exposes is not a Mongol secret, but a vulnerability that persists. Any system that depends on coordination, legitimacy, and timing can be defeated without being confronted directly. Not by strength alone, but by pressure applied where doctrine is blind. The danger is not that this lesson exists. The danger is that it is often recognized only after it has already worked. Because the most decisive strategies do not announce themselves. They leave the enemy standing and finish the war somewhere else.